You know, the mid-2000s was a very interesting time if you're a Nintendo fan. Like, there were some crazy great games released on the Nintendo DS. Actually, if you look at the top 10 list of best-selling DS games, you see franchises that are easily still around today. You have the Mario games, some Pokemon games, Animal Crossing Wild World made the top 10, and they still make Brain Age games technically on the Switch. But the number 2 game that sold 23.96 million units seemingly has been completely ignored and forgotten about when it comes to Nintendo and what their plans are currently. We're talking about Nintendogs. Yes, this game series, all versions of it, sold 23.96 million copies and was the second best-selling DS game. Literally, anyone who had a DS had Nintendogs practically. Everyone seemed to want the game, and then when people got tired of it, it became like a very inexpensive game to buy used at like game resellers. So I felt like this game had like touched so many different people back in the day. So you gotta wonder, why hasn't Nintendo utilized one of their own properties that is so massively successful and use it in the current gaming landscape? I think this game actually falls into one of the categories of Nintendo being possibly worried that it wouldn't make a big enough return on their investment, as maybe Nintendogs was hitting a virtual pet trend that had been building up for years prior, peaked with Nintendogs, and then maybe after that there isn't too much hope that this genre of game would resonate with much of the Nintendo Switch audience. To be fair, the people who would be nostalgic about Nintendogs are mostly adults nowadays, and I don't know how many of us really want to play a pet simulator game. A lot of us just have real pets on our own now. Nintendogs was so massively popular, it caused so many other game studios to produce their own watered down pet simulator games. Like there was the dogs and cats games with Z's at the end. There was like Purr Pals. We'll talk more on that in a second, but we actually do have a sponsor today. Wow. Are you ready to roll the dice and take a trip down memory lane? Then look no further than Monopoly Go. Experience classic Monopoly fun with a modern twist tailored for your phone. Collect properties, build houses and hotels, draw chance cards, and earn Monopoly money in gameplay designed for the digital age. This game is really cool. It has the classic Monopoly atmosphere, complete with familiar faces, spaces like locations. Even the infamous jail is there. It's that timeless board game that you know and love right in the palm of your hand, but with a ton of new features, making it a great way to enjoy Monopoly. Monopoly Go has new offers and opportunities every day. You can join tournaments, play in like this cool prize drop Plinko minigame. You could try your luck with Cash Grab and stay on the edge of your seat with hourly events and exciting rewards. Every day brings fresh new ways to play and win, so don't miss out on the classic fun and exciting new features of Monopoly Go. Download it now and start building your Monopoly empire today. Okay, let's talk about Nintendogs some more. Nintendo did try to bring Nintendogs back one time that not as many people might remember compared to the original Nintendogs. But yeah, when the 3DS released, they did release Nintendogs and Cats, which was like the new Nintendogs experience that also lets you have cats. But comparatively, Nintendogs plus Cats, which released in 2011, didn't really sell nearly as much as the previous Nintendogs series did. Nintendogs plus Cats sold only 4.69 million units, which is obviously a substantial drop from the original DS versions. And mind you, this massive drop-off was pretty much in a period of just 6 years from when Nintendogs first released to when Nintendogs plus Cats for the 3DS released. Now, of course, the 3DS didn't do very well in the early years of it existing, but perhaps the giant drop-off in just a few years dissuaded Nintendo from ever really doing anything with Nintendogs again, as now even more time has passed. But I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility of Nintendogs one day making another reappearance, but I can see why Nintendo is hesitant to do anything with it. You know, during the later years of the Nintendo Wii U's life, Nintendo was really put into a predicament with how long The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was taking to be developed. It saw various delays and eventually would launch on the Nintendo Switch alongside the Wii U, but man, Nintendo had kind of spread themselves thin with a lot of their IPs, and they needed to put some games out that were like related to big intellectual properties, not only to keep the Wii U somewhat relevant, but also in an attempt to appease the fans that have invested money in the Wii U. If you want them to keep buying consoles in the future, you have to show them that at least they're being taken care of. So 2016 saw the release of Star Fox Zero, the first new Star Fox game in pretty much a decade. And despite the fact that the series had already been rebooted and remade, Star Fox Zero would be another reboot and was first unveiled as a tech demo at E3 2014. At this time in development, Nintendo had said said that they didn't have a studio working on the game yet, but they were looking to have a studio go and make the game based off of the demo and work that they've already done. And the next year, the game was set with a release date of 2015, and Platinum Games would be taking the engine and things that had already been built and fleshing it out into a full-length game. That's a very short development time, and the game did see a short delay until early 2016, but the game was already plagued by a lot of Nintendo fans being hesitant about the gameplay shown off of the game. The graphics didn't really look all that great. I mean, they weren't bad, but they didn't look like visually compelling, and the gameplay looked like essentially a more complicated version of the Nintendo 64 version of the game. I mean, the Wii U gamepad integration, where you have to look at the gamepad to aim, was a novel idea, probably something that would have worked better if it came out at the launch of the Wii U's life, not after people had already played the Wii U, experienced the gimmick, and kind of moved on and just wanted games. So of course, the new gameplay layout made things feel like there were just going to be extra hoops you'd have to go to just aim your R-Wing, which was something so easily done in the old Star Fox games. But this was like Nintendo's big final hurrah for the Wii U, essentially, and they did go kind of all out in trying to promote this game. They gave it this whole anime episode that was released on YouTube just to build up hype for the game. There were showcases. They even put this other game tech demo that they'd showed off at E3 a few years earlier as like a rebranded experience called Star Fox Guard. It was just this other unrelated game called Project Guard. And then the game released to okay reviews, mostly positive, but not outstanding either. And Star Fox Zero ended up selling not well at all. Matter of fact, it sold less than 500,000 units. It was estimated that it only sold about 440,000 units. I think the lackluster sales made Nintendo want to just kind of wash their hands from this game altogether. And while we were seeing so many Nintendo Wii U releases start to appear on Nintendo Switch as like an ultimate edition and ported over, like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, and others, Star Fox Zero would not release on the Nintendo Switch. We did see Star Fox used in like a weird crossover that Nintendo set up with Ubisoft and their upcoming game Starlink Battle for Atlas, where the Star Fox team would be playable on the Nintendo Switch version of the game and have a little story arc dedicated to them, except Starlink Battle for Atlas also didn't sell well at all. Actually, it was a pretty massive flop for Ubisoft. And ultimately, it's just a real shame the way that Star Fox has been handled, to a point where Nintendo's probably incredibly hesitant to ever use this franchise again. As a kid, I loved Star Fox 64, and I played Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assault and even Star Fox Command. And despite the little issues here and there, I feel like Star Fox Assault was really when the game series was starting to hit its stride. Like, it started to reintroduce old characters, flesh them out, put a new villain, and try to like have a dynamic between characters. And I think if they took a Star Fox game and they had like good storytelling nowadays and good personal character growth, and then, you know, good gameplay as well, and like a mix of gameplay experiences, I think a game could do really well. It just can't rely on gimmicks like the Wii U gamepad controls or the little like figurines that Starlink Battle for Atlas tried to incorporate. Okay, now some of you might be surprised that yes, I am putting Metroid Prime 4 on this list. Nintendo is obviously working on it. I mean, it was announced years ago and then they restarted development on it, but this should just show, if anything, that Nintendo is incredibly cautious about what they're doing with Metroid moving forward. Actually, this isn't even too different to what is going on with the Star Fox series. Back in the Wii era, it seemed like there was a lot of ideas being thrown around for how to take both of these series in different directions. And there were even rumors for a while that there was like a Star Fox Metroid game that would have like combined the two being worked on. That obviously never happened, but we did later find out that there was a Star Fox prototype being built for the Wii that never did release. But we did get something for Metroid after the Metroid Prime trilogy had ended, and that was Metroid Other M. This was like Nintendo's attempt to try to redirect the Metroid franchise into something more narrative driven, and it was pretty panned across the board when it released. It just ultimately didn't shine a light to how awesome the Metroid Prime trilogy games were. I mean, some of the story was kind of goofy. And then after that, there was kind of a little bit of a hiatus on new Metroid games. Now, over the years, it seems like Nintendo has gotten a good grasp on what they want to do with Metroid in the 2D space or the 2.5D space. And as far as like a big cinematic sci-fi experience, kind of akin to what they had done with the original Metroid Prime trilogy, things games were kind of vague. They did revive Metroid Prime randomly after Other M in the form of Metroid Prime Federation Force, that 3-player co-op game for the 3DS that no one played. I'd like to refuse to believe that anyone actually has played this game. But obviously, Metroid Prime 4 was a really big announcement, and then Nintendo, to make an announcement a few years later that they were restarting development altogether, leads me to honestly believe, truly, that Nintendo is incredibly cautious with how they handle this intellectual property moving forward. And to be fair, while a lot of the games that we're going to talk about on today's list are games that I think Nintendo should fully embrace, I fully understand the cautiousness around the Metroid Prime 4 game here. They definitely don't want to release something that is mediocre, because Metroid truly does have the potential to be one of Nintendo's biggest heavy-hitting games. Matter of fact, it kind of always had. And they essentially have two options. They can release a game that is just kind of a mediocre subpar shooter, which Nintendo really hasn't had the best track record with, like, first-person shooter type games. Or they can finally make something so excellent that not only do Metroid fans come to play and experience, but also other more casual players that play more mature games in general will want to jump on board and play as well. And I have a feeling that they might be holding off on Metroid Prime 4 information until the next generation console releases, as they're going to want to grab that crowd that, you know, picked up The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild day one on Nintendo Switch. They really want a game that attracts all audiences, even the older crowd, to establish the console's core fan base first. Nintendo doesn't really have the best reputation with a lot of their consoles. Usually after a successful console, the follow-up struggles a bit. So it's going to be interesting to see how Nintendo moves forward with the next generation console. I'm sure they want to avoid that being a trend again. So I'm curious to see what stops they pull out to avoid repeating, you know, the GameCube or the Wii U, which didn't sell very well when they first released. At the same time though, there are other IPs that I feel like Nintendo should be utilizing that they just choose not to utilize, even if the stakes surrounding the franchise aren't nearly as high, like F-Zero, for example. Now, after years of nothing, I mean truly just years and years and years of nothing F-Zero related, the closest thing we had was, I guess, Captain Falcon showing up in Super Smash Bros. We've seen a little resurgence in interest from Nintendo as they added this like Battle Royale mode to F-Zero, which is insane, like just taking the Super Nintendo game and making it 100 player. But after the GameCube release, why didn't we ever see anything of F-Zero again? I suspect with all the CGI animation that was in the F-Zero game and how they crafted the story, maybe there was a really expensive budget put into that game, and ultimately F-Zero GX didn't sell that well comparatively to the other F-Zero games before it. But I feel like they could do a much lower budget F-Zero game, maybe not sell it for $60, but make it like a $30 smaller project. And if you advertise the game and you do maybe some new updates and expansions and show it off at Nintendo Directs, I actually think they could get a decent sized player base surrounding the game as long as it plays decently. I don't know, I always felt like the characters that have been around in the Super Smash Bros. Series of games for the longest amount of time, like Captain Falcon being one of the original fighters in the Nintendo 64 version all the way back in the day. And of course, same goes for Fox, same goes for Samus, and even Ness from EarthBound, which we'll get to. I feel like these are iconic characters and that their franchises shouldn't be abandoned for as long as they kind of have been. Okay, I mentioned Ness and now we have to talk about it, but the EarthBound series, what happened? First of all, people have been wanting Mother 3 for forever. We've talked about it on this channel even before. We won't go into more details about why Mother 3 needs to be made, but more so, I feel like this universe as a whole could be expanded on so much more. Sure, the story might have kind of wrapped up in a decent enough way already, but there's so many other options they could do to build out the universe with other stories, other characters in a spin-off type-esque experience. And I think RPGs are really starting to see a bigger resurgence. I mean, JRPGs have always been popular, but now more than ever, as people are experiencing other game series like Persona and stuff like that, I think that there's a lot of room to kind of like come in with something different with this very stylized art direction, the quirkiness of the world. Doing something in 3D would be really amazing. It's a shame that that EarthBound N64 game never came into fruition. I still haven't fully been able to wrap my head around why we don't see EarthBound or Mother used nowadays, why we haven't even gotten the Mother 3 port localized in English, why we haven't gotten any type of follow-up game when there's such a demand from the fan base for it. Sure, Nintendo will have HAL Laboratories make 30 more Kirby games before we see anything from EarthBound, it seems, but I can't help but to wonder why Nintendo is so hesitant. Do they think that it doesn't resonate with English-speaking audiences or Western audiences? I feel like that's a weird case to make considering how popular fan dubs are online and how fan-made projects get so much attention when like a fan tries to make their own Mother 4 game. There's automatically like a core base of fans interested in it, at least just because of that. Golden Sun is an interesting game series that fans are constantly asking Nintendo to please revive in some way or another. It's developed by Camelot, but of course Nintendo is the publisher here, and so far, while I haven't played these games yet, there have been 3 releases, 2 on the Game Boy Advance and 1 on the Nintendo DS, and more recently, they just were added to the whole like Nintendo Game Boy Advance Nintendo Switch membership thing that they have going on. So it's like Nintendo understands the popularity and the demand and want for this game series to see a return. I mean, when it comes to JRPGs with Nintendo, it feels like they always go for the wacky and wild route. I mean, we get Pokemon, we get like Paper Mario. Do you count that as a JRPG? But where's something that's like truly based on like the classic fantasy type world? Golden Sun had that going for it. And the fact that it had successful handheld games means that the potential for having a successful, full-blown, high-quality experience could be really high. I mean, look at Xenoblade Chronicles, for example. I just think that this one might be one that Nintendo's been sleeping on for too long. It's been almost 14 years, Nintendo, since our last release. What's going on? Now, we also did a video not too long ago about game series that Nintendo seems to neglect, and we did talk about Kid Icarus in that video, so we won't talk about it for too long, but it always seems weird to me that Nintendo has so many IPs that are popular and at least somewhat well known, especially because of the existence of Super Smash Bros. So you'd almost think like Nintendo would capitalize on some of these franchises, but for some reason they always seem very hesitant to. Kid Icarus is one of them. The character was completely redesigned, modernized, and brought to the forefront with Super Smash Bros. Brawl for Nintendo Wii, and after that, we did hear that there would be a full, fresh reboot to the game series in the form of Kid Icarus Uprising for the 3DS, a game that not too many people picked up because it came out in the early years of the 3DS before people were really picking up 3DS games. I actually thought this game was pretty interesting, pretty cool of a concept, and a game that I think would do great as a remaster brought to Nintendo Switch as a starting point for potentially a new series for a new generation of people to get into something Nintendo related that's maybe a little bit different. It's like Nintendo knows that they have The Legend of Zelda and that's like their big adventure game, but in between releases of Zelda games, I feel like something like Kid Icarus showing up could also appease those fans who are waiting around for something Zelda related to have something different, but still something that holds on to that core value of like adventure. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that. I am still surprised we don't see these IPs used in other forms. Similarly, Ice Climbers was brought into Super Smash Bros. All the way back in Melee, just being kind of modernized from the NES version of the game that originally released. And I'm so surprised we never got another Ice Climbers game. I genuinely feel like ever since Nintendo lost Rareware back towards the start of the GameCube era, the old school 3D platforming genre kind of died off. I mean, sure, there was oversaturation, and Nintendo would still manage to come back time and time again with Mario doing something in that space, which was always good. I mean, there was Mario Sunshine, Mario Galaxies, and Odyssey, which were great, but we went from the glory days of so many different collectathon platformers to seeing the genre really refined and streamlined into a way that, you know, has less backtracking and more unique experiences, to just not really having all that many though, despite the fact that the games now play better than ever. I think Ice Climbers would be a great way to fill that void that I feel like is missing in the 3D platforming genre, because Banjo-Kazooie's not there, Conker's not there, Donkey Kong 64 will never be there, especially since Donkey Kong's like repurposed to like the side-scrolling adventure. Why not do something different? Throw Ice Climbers in there and create something that's traditional but unique, where you take control of 2 different characters. How can their abilities together work to move ahead and have different types of movement than a traditional platformer? I think it could be really cool. If they don't want to do that, then they can bring a different IP back, like Starfy. That's one that people really miss. It was just like a simple platforming game back in the day, but it is a Nintendo platformer. They could resurrect that. I have noticed some people online calling for the Star Tropics game series to come back for some reason. These games date all the way back to the NES days and were an RPG game following the character Mike Jones. That's like a very generic character name, I feel like. This is what he looked like. But nonetheless, this game is classified as like a forgotten gem of the old school Nintendo days. Now, Star Tropics maybe maybe didn't catch on as big as some of these other games, mostly because they came out kind of late in the NES life cycle, and the sequel, the last game ever made, came out in 1994, well after the Super Nintendo had released, but it's still only released on the original NES. There's been rumors here and there that this series is coming back, though it never has, but still, Nintendo occasionally will make a little reference here and there to Star Tropics in more modern things, so I mean, it's still on their mind, it's just not relevant, I guess. Okay, you know what? Forget Miitopia. I know Miitopia exists, and it's cool and all, but it's not Tomodachi Life 2. I'm tired of people saying that it is. Okay, Tomodachi Life was an incredibly weird, but very unique premise of a game in general. Like, it just has all these very unique scenarios, and obviously it utilizes, like, the Nintendo Mii characters, which is always a plus. I mean, look at these guys. Sure, some of the game might be simplistic, and sometimes things are a little bit weird, but I think that was the charm of Tomodachi Life. And the fact that this game came out in, like, the 2014 era when, like, I don't know, I feel like comedy like this and, like, experiences that you have in games being shared on a larger scale were kind of like a new cutting edge thing. I mean, this was like during the time where like Let's Plays on YouTube were the biggest thing ever. I think it just gave everybody like this experience where you're like, this is kind of funny. Look at this. Look at this thing that this game did, or whatever. This scenario this game put me in. It's really hard to explain by today's standards what I'm talking about, but if you played Tomodachi Life or you were just like around in 2013 online, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think Nintendo struggled a bit when figuring out how to localize this game for the West, because obviously like a lot of jokes and stuff from like Japanese culture doesn't translate directly, and they had to kind of push the game hard explaining how it worked, which might have slowed down maybe the initial pace of the game, but the game still ended up selling really well. It was like the 10th best-selling 3DS game. They even did like celebrity crossovers with like Shaquille O'Neal and Taylor Swift having clothing lines that you could get in the game, which is insane. And I think overall the people that picked up this game mostly felt pretty positive towards it and would have liked to see where this series would go. We just didn't expect it to be kind of ditched in favor of something like Miitopia. I mean, it's great that Miitopia was included in the Switch, like that's cool and all, but the premises of these games are completely different. Now, there were a couple of things in Tomodachi Life that maybe wouldn't hold up as well today, and there would have to be some fine-tuning and revision, so a direct port of Tomodachi Life might not be like on Nintendo's plans, because that would involve a lot of work and back reworking to bring the game up to like current day standards of what would be expected. They definitely have to like put more inclusive scenarios in the game, so a Tomodachi Life 2 would probably be the best route to go, but I think Nintendo won't pull the trigger on it just because there are a lot of like social expectations that this game would have, especially because things were already criticized in the first game for not being very inclusive with like the LGBT community. So a future game would need to kind of showcase more of that, and I feel like Nintendo is always so hesitant on pressing on that specific topic that they wouldn't do it altogether. It's like the whole Animal Crossing New Horizons thing where everybody was like, CJ and Flick, they're like a perfect couple, look at them, and Nintendo's like, yeah, they're just business partners, totally just business partners, don't even look into it. I feel like it just puts a game like Tomodachi Life more in like this odd space where they'd rather do something like a successor type series like Miitopia or Miitomo instead, and I don't know, I wish we would get a Tomodachi Life 2. I feel like it would be pretty great. Moving on, I think Custom Robo would be a great opportunity for Nintendo to bring a new game series that's based on something that was really popular for a while back. Custom Robo was really big through like the Nintendo 64 era, it was on the Game Boy, it made it all the way to the Nintendo DS, and then bam, nothing, ever again. Goodbye series. Now, Custom Robo had maybe a rough start because it wasn't released in the West until later entries in the game series, which might have maybe reduced the overall pool of players who could potentially play Custom Robo, but it did eventually make its way to the West, so I'm surprised that Nintendo wouldn't use this as like a springboard to continue to capitalize on this type of genre of game, it being this like RPG game with custom robos. The weird thing is Nintendo's just odd with the way that they handle this series, almost like they're afraid to localize it again for the West. They recently put Custom Robo, the first two games, on the Nintendo Switch Online Nintendo 64 emulator thing, but only in Japan. I mean, I get that it was never localized, but I'm pretty sure like the West audience would be okay with that and still would enjoy figuring it out along the way. Or they could always, you know, just throw some money at translating it. This is Nintendo we're talking about. It's not like they don't have the money to do a quick localization of a game, translating text. I mean, it's Nintendo. They definitely have the money to do something at that scale if they really wanted to. It's really weird because it always seems like Nintendo is very calculated in how they want to scale out their IPs, but then also they're kind of quick to ditch some of their IPs, like Custom Robo, if they need to. You know, one game that I see brought up all the time when it comes to a game series Nintendo really needs to bring back. The game Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem from the Nintendo GameCube era. It was developed by a studio called Silicon Knights, and they went bankrupt a few years back due to this like really messy lawsuit with Epic Games over the Unreal Engine. It was like a whole thing, but it's believed that Nintendo retains the rights as the publisher to the Eternal Darkness IP. It's like this third-person action-adventure puzzle-esque game, and has like this deep story with multiple different characters and like this whole like insanity feature that's a part of the game. It has like a branching story, there's different paths you can take. It's a pretty interesting experience looking back for something that released in 2002. The game released to really high critical acclaim, even if maybe the game didn't see like as much of a worldwide interest being on the GameCube, and I just think not that many people even knew that Eternal Darkness existed. But it being a solid game that has such a big cult following, it wouldn't be crazy for Nintendo to choose to revive this franchise, though they could have some hesitations based on some of the years following the release of Eternal Darkness. I mean, of course, the sales figures weren't the highest, and that could be one incentive Nintendo has to not want to make this game. The lawsuit that happened between the developing studio for this game and Epic was really messy, resulting in Silicon Knights, the studio, shutting down. But then also the creator of the game, Dennis Dyack, started a Kickstarter to try to get a new studio started up in order to do a spiritual successor, not necessarily called Eternal Darkness, but a new game series called Shadow of the Eternals. And despite attempting 2 different Kickstarter campaigns, both of them failed to reach their goals, so that project ended up going on indefinite hold. While this game does have a big cult following, maybe it doesn't have as much of a rabid fan base as what Nintendo would be looking for in bringing this franchise back to life. Maybe one day Nintendo will do some sort of really cool reboot revival to this, throw it on like the Switch with like a GameCube service on Nintendo Online one day, but outside of that, I really don't see them bringing Eternal Darkness back anytime soon. Okay, it's been 10 long years pretty much since Mario Kart 8 initially released on the Wii U. During that time, there's been DLC, there's been a re-release for the Nintendo Switch including all the DLC, then they added even more DLC to that version, and it's still being supported now. And I understand why Nintendo doesn't want to make another Mario Kart game right now. They easily could, but if this is working, why change up the formula? Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the best-selling Nintendo Switch game, so I'm not going to make a case for Mario Kart needing a new game just yet, despite the fact that fans want it. What I am going to talk about is another kart racing game, Diddy Kong Racing. Man, Diddy Kong Racing was so incredible in the Nintendo 64 days. It was co-developed with Rareware, and they had to like make this deal to remake it for the Nintendo DS later on after Xbox purchased Rareware. But I'm pretty sure ultimately Nintendo owns the rights to Diddy Kong and the whole racing IP here. This game was just really, really fun back in the day. It essentially was a kart racing game that was more simplified and had less of like the random weapons that you could get, which added a whole lot of RNG to the races. So it became a little more skill focused, but it also was kind of merged with a lot of the ideas of like adventure collectathons, where you have like an open hub world and you travel location to location and you find collectibles and also win races. I loved Diddy Kong Racing. I still think it's one of the better kart racers out there, and I think if Nintendo is just going to take their time with working on Mario Kart and not release a new Mario Kart game, you know, in 10-year bases, maybe they could at least bring back Diddy Kong Racing and we could see some new game releases during the in-between years when we don't have necessarily a new Mario Kart game. I think that'd keep people interested in kart racers because there's a lot of familiar characters, and also, I mean, it's just another game that they could be selling as well. I think Mario Kart 8 sold incredibly well, but they maybe could have made even more money if they had just another game project out there as well. I don't know if Nintendo's really going to want to do it, maybe because they want to avoid any type of litigation or problems with Microsoft. I'm pretty sure it's an open and shut case that Nintendo owns the rights to Diddy Kong and can do whatever they want with that, but maybe they don't want to just even go down the route of making a Diddy Kong Racing game in case that could be something to go to court, and just court fees, lawyer fees, and, you know, setting yourself up to defend yourself costs a lot of money. Not that Nintendo doesn't have money to spend, but it just Nintendo doesn't want to spend money. Wario Land is another game that sometimes gets brought up from time to time, and it is interesting to think about Wario in a different sense because the character himself shows up everywhere. He's in like the Mario Party games. He has his own WarioWare series, which were all these like little micro mini games, something that kind of died off for a minute, and then with the Switch they brought it back, and then it sold okay-ish, so then they brought it back again for another game. Somewhere in the mid-2000s we lost Wario for where he originated from in games like Wario Woods or something like that, to him being kind of the host of this like micro game, mini game combination type experience. Still, Wario Land was a very interesting concept of a game. It just took platforming in a different direction. It was a unique idea, and I think some people still feel fondly about this version of Wario rather than the version that we see in the micro game type collection. I don't know, I think it'd be interesting to see this type of anti-hero show up as the hero of a full game, and whether they do something 2D related like Wario Land or 3D related like Wario Land 64, which doesn't exist. If they did something 3D related that would bring Wario to like the level of a 3D Mario game, I don't know. I feel like that could be really good. Why won't Nintendo do it? I don't know. They don't like good ideas. Probably with something with WarioWare where they want to preserve like the WarioWare brand that they've established so much. Remember when he was revealed in Super Smash Bros. Brawl? It was a really big deal, but it showed off his character wearing like the newer WarioWare clothing. Just another way or example of them trying to disconnect WarioWare necessarily from existing specifically in the Mario universe. I mean, he still shows up in like Mario Kart and other things like that, but you understand where I'm coming from here when I'm saying that it'd be really cool to see WarioWare's own universe built up, you know, his origin universe or the one that he shares with Mario in some sort of timeline, built to an extent that's maybe more so than what we see built for Wario in WarioWare. It kind of surprises me though that characters like Wario can get pushed in such a corner though, especially with how iconic and identifiable a character like this is. Also, while we're at it, Waluigi's never had his own game, or a game where he's even like a bigger sidekick to Wario. He's just kind of there for the party games. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. They do a party game, they introduce a brand new character to be in the roster. That's a little bit different, but hey, it worked. But I would like to see Wario doing something other than just like competing in whatever Mario game, mini game thing is popular at the time. Sin and Punishment originally released on the Nintendo 64, but didn't see a Western release, which was really disappointing. This game came out in the year 2000, taking place in the ultra futuristic year of 2007 when this like war breaks out, and essentially you go and you run through this shooter game that's kind of like an on-rail shooter. It feels like Star Fox 64, but only the tank levels. It has some pretty epic boss fights, maybe some other over-the-top moments, but the game never really saw a wide release in the West. It only finally came to the West with the Nintendo Switch Online functionality, and it was kind of one of the early Nintendo 64 games, and that's where I first played this game. I had a lot of fun playing it. I had a lot of trouble being good at the game, but it was cool to see something Nintendo 64 related, as the Nintendo 64 is easily one of my favorite consoles to ever exist. They did bring back Sin and Punishment in some ways or another. There was a Nintendo Wii version. It would be cool to see more of the series brought back out, maybe a reimagining of the original story with updated graphics, something that Nintendo players could get behind, because knowing about this game kind of makes you want to maybe play it and give it a try. Okay, let's talk about Pokemon for a quick second. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, super underrated series. I know like Nintendo's pumped them out, and I know they are popular to an extent, especially back in the DS games. They pumped these things out on a regular basis, and they had decent narratives, and the gameplay was actually pretty cool. This like dungeon crawling type game where you get to actually play as a Pokemon. You uncover mysteries, you're like a detective in some of them. It's a neat experience. That being said, I wonder if Nintendo's very, very hesitant with doing more with the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series nowadays. Back in the earlier days, it seemed like there was a new one every couple of years. It was really well supported, but now when we look at the Switch Life, we just got a remake of the original one, which mind you, was pretty cool. They took the art direction and like stylized the whole game around it, and I thought this would maybe be like the new introduction to maybe do more stuff in the future, but the studio that makes the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games is also known for making Mystery Dungeon games or other games. Like their thing is Mystery Dungeons, not necessarily Pokemon. So it's kind of like Nintendo's in the situation where they have to collaborate with the studio to make a true to form Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, unless Nintendo just decides to like spin off and do its own thing altogether. And maybe this other studio is too preoccupied working on other things. They did come back to work on the remake of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, but outside of that, it seems like they're just side questing other games right now. Is it Nintendo's choice to not want to make more of these and where they worry about like Pokemon oversaturation? And obviously when I mean Nintendo, I mean like Nintendo / the Pokemon company, because like it's more than just Nintendo here. Or is this more just because like there's not availability to have the right team working on a Mystery Dungeon game? It's a weird one, but I'd like to see this one come back. I'm probably the only person who thinks this next one, but Pokemon Battle Revolution. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who have wanted to see like Pokemon Gale of Darkness or Pokemon Coliseum make its comeback in some way or another, and I'm all for that also, though nowadays I I feel like main Pokemon games are almost on par with what they did back on the GameCube. The only difference is like art direction versus like graphical fidelity. I'm pretty sure the Switch could handle the things that they did back on the GameCube days. They are just choosing to stylize things differently. But I specifically want Battle Revolution back because I feel like there actually is a really good opportunity to do something special here. Not only could they give that stylized art direction that people really like that looks a little more realistic than maybe the more cartoony thing that we see in the main release games, but it would be amazing to get a true to form Pokemon battle simulator that allows you to compete with other trainers and maybe have a competitive ranking system as well that's detached from the old school Pokemon training type experience. Remember back in the Pokemon Stadium days, if you didn't have like a Game Boy cartridge to connect to your Pokemon Stadium, you could rent Pokemon and like register them and use them for battle. Something like that, but brought into the same way that you could do in Battle Revolution, would be incredible, especially if they emulated a lot of the things that you can do in like the fan-made game Pokemon Showdown. Showdown has been hugely successful for over a decade just because of the fact that it's a true to form Pokemon battle simulator. It lets you choose and build any team that you want. You just apply the stats the way that is legally allowed. It checks to make sure your Pokemon are legal. You pick your attacks and then you go right into battle and you can test and tweak your Pokemon team. Then once you have your solid Pokemon team together, you can go through the process of trying to catch the Pokemon in your real game, train your Pokemon up and have it ready to go. But I think a lot of people just ended up liking the battle simulator and they just mained that instead, building different types of teams and seeing what works and competing in different tiers of Pokemon battling. Right now, if you play in an actual Pokemon game like Scarlet and Violet Online with a random person, they probably have like some legendary Pokemon they sweep you with, and if you play in like Pokemon Showdown, there's at least different categories of Pokemon team builds, so you can make teams that fit into these different leagues and you get to try all types of Pokemon competitively, and that's really cool. I'd love to see an officially supported idea like this translated for a Nintendo console, and I think bringing back like Battle Revolution or, you know, Pokemon Stadium would be a perfect fit for something like this. I don't know if Nintendo's choice in not wanting to do this is because they don't necessarily want to build like a service for a main Pokemon experience that would go on for a very long time. I mean, Nintendo's built on releasing Pokemon content pretty regularly, and something like this wouldn't necessarily be something that needed to be refreshed or upgraded. And now that Nintendo's this all-in-one type console, it's not like they're adding some sort of weird alternative to home consoles while the main games are played on the handhelds. I don't see this one happening, but it's just such a good idea. I'd really like to see something like this implemented. You know, back in the early days of the Nintendo Switch, during a Nintendo Direct, Nintendo really, and I mean really, pushed this game that they were working on with another studio called Sushi Striker. I mean, it looks like a fun game, but I think a lot of people were really surprised to find out that this was like also releasing on the 3DS. And then there was a Switch version released, but I mean, it's a Switch version of a 3DS game essentially. Nintendo really wanted this to be like the next big thing, and it didn't really sell all that well. I think conceptually here the game was cool, but I think the fact that this game ended up getting such lackluster sales, and then also it's often associated with the 3DS as it was one of the last 3DS games that was released, I don't think too many people cared or even noticed that it was re-released on Nintendo Switch. And I think if anything, that kind of like doubles down the fact that this game series might not come back. Even more so, the studio that worked on this game actually had a long history of working directly with Nintendo's since all the way back during the Famicom years. But maybe things got sour after Sushi Striker's released. We see that the studio's been working on other projects, working directly with Square Enix, seeing things that they work on released on platforms that aren't Nintendo. Like, look, they released this Threat Rhythm game that's not necessarily like a Nintendo exclusive release. It's kind of weird to see a studio that almost was like a second party studio to Nintendo, other than like who owns the company, for quite some time, just kind of pivot away. And it could have all been just because Sushi Striker maybe put them in a tough spot and they had to look at different options to keep their own company alive. There are a couple other honorable mentions of games that I think are worth bringing up and just mentioning for this video that we don't need to dive into. There's obviously a lot of like one and done games that Nintendo has done that they probably won't be revisited, and they have a small following, but if they were to really bring them back, they'd have to like do almost a soft reboot to the series to get a new audience on. So games like Magical Star Sign, Endless Ocean, I don't see these two coming back necessarily because I think Nintendo doesn't see that there's enough interest there, but I'd be down to see them come back. I'd be down to see so many different types of things come back if Nintendo was willing just to throw a little bit of money at them. I'd even be okay with them reviving a rhythm game like Elite Beat Agents or Rhythm Heaven. I mean, rhythm games are kind of back in with Fortnite now, I think, so I mean, they could do something like that, but also competing directly with Fortnite nowadays is kind of a weird thing to attempt, and Nintendo's kind of the last holdout, I feel like, for Fortnite as far as like collaborations go. Fortnite's conquered everything but Nintendo so far, so I don't know if Nintendo directly wants to compete or not, or if they're just gonna kind of like let this one go. I still stand by what I said earlier about new intellectual properties or reviving some old properties and turning them into like a new thing. I'd be okay with something like Balloon Fight coming back in some sort of modern form. I know they've kind of used the villager from Animal Crossing as like a monument to that, even though it's not really like a direct reboot or related in any way. Still, I think that there's a lot of options Nintendo has. Do a lot of these sound hopeless? Yes, but also Mario RPG got a remake, and that was something that nobody thought was ever going to happen. That was something that people thought was a dead series. If Mario RPG hadn't released this year, it probably would have been on this list as something that Nintendo was too scared to do. So they can make bold moves. It's just a matter of whether or not they actually want to. So what do you guys think about all of this and these games? Are there any you definitely agree with? Let me know in the comments down below, or if I missed anything, definitely let me know in the comments. I do read my comments from time to time, especially if people are being nice. If you're new and you enjoyed this type of content, it's a little bit longer format, it's a little different, maybe subscribe. I know it takes an extra second if you're like on the TV to click the subscribe button, I know it, but I appreciate it. I see you doing it, so thank you. I mean, I don't really see you doing it, but you get what I mean. Nonetheless, I did another video like this where I talked about multiple games on a game series that Nintendo has neglected, so that's something maybe interesting to look at. Or you can look at all the Animal Crossing content I have on this channel. There's quite a bit, and I try to keep it unique and different from like what normal Animal Crossing people do. So yeah, that's my plug. Okay, we'll see you guys next time with a new video.